Okay, wonderful. I believe we are now live. Welcome, everyone. Um, I see we've got our viewers. Wonderful. Okay. Um, my name is Quinn Moore. I work for the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture in Philadelphia. I am extremely happy to welcome all of those viewing at home to what is Collegium's final event, final special event of the year on this Feast of St. Juan Diego, which is extremely relevant to our discussion today. It's almost like we planned it like this. If you are here, you are joining us for this special event featuring Professor Christopher Shannon, who I will introduce in just a moment, a Catholic vision for American history, the stakes of Our Lady of Guadalupe for an alternative modernity framework. Um, we're extremely excited to have Christopher Shannon join us. Professor Shannon is a professor of history at Christendom College. He did his undergraduate work at Rochester University and his graduate work at Yale University. His research spans intellectual and cultural history, about the American experience, the immigrant experience, Catholic history. And so we're very excited to welcome him to share about how Our Lady of Guadalupe and perhaps Catholic history more broadly can be a helpful interpretive lens, interpretive device for understanding the history of the United States. For those who are viewing at home, just a little context of how this evening will run. Um, Professor Shannon will be speaking for about 30 minutes. As he's speaking, we invite you to include your questions in the chat box, which you can access on YouTube. So feel free to put those in chat. And after Professor Shannon's remarks have concluded, we'll begin a brief question and answer. We'll try and address as many questions as we can from the audience. But please share your questions as they come, and we will hopefully be able to get through many of them. So without further ado, I will stop talking and I will turn it over to Professor Shannon.
My turn to talk now. Okay, well, thank you very much, Quinn. I'd like to start by thanking you and Dan Shealy and Fran Mayer and everybody at the Collegium Institute for allowing me to speak on such a scandalous, dare I say, professionally blasphemous topic. It is, in fact, doubly scandalous and blasphemous. First, the very idea of a Catholic approach to any kind of history threatens to break through the big, beautiful border wall of separation that the profession has erected between the supposedly incompatible worlds of faith and reason. Second, the notion that Catholicism, even simply as a historical topic, matters much in United States history flies in the face of the grand narratives historians continue to construct to describe and explain America. I think of Jill Lepore's recent reigning narrative synthesis, These Truths, that seems to devote more space to Fox News than to the Catholic Church in American history. The empirical fact that Catholics have generally made up roughly 20 to 25% of the population for much of American history, closer to 50% if you focus on cities, these numbers matter little. Historians of American Catholicism have bemoaned this state of affairs for decades, to little effect. Today, I would like to present this problem as an opportunity. Anti-Catholic prejudice aside, Catholics remain marginal to American history because distinctly Catholic experiences are, in fact, marginal to the narratives that drive mainstream US history, most of which amount to variations on the story of the progressive unfolding of individual autonomy, understood as the liberation from received traditions. The Catholic alternative to this narrative lies not in an unthinking commitment to tradition against modernity, but rather in the creation of an alternative modernity, one that synthesizes the old and the new within the limits of an enduring Catholic communalism, a synthesis, I think, best captured by the tradition of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Mestizo Virgin, whose feast we celebrate this week. Now, before I get into the specifics of this Catholic alternative modernity and the way that Our Lady of Guadalupe relates to this, I feel I need to situate what I'm going to do in the context of the current practice of history within the profession. Is what I'm proposing is decidedly not a hostile takeover of history by theology. I am in part simply doing what historians have been doing, mainstream secular historians have been doing for the last 50 years, bringing a previously marginal history to the center of our historical narrative. Up through the 1950s, US history was largely history as politics past, with generally liberal historians telling the generally heroic story of the rise of modern liberalism from the Progressive era through the New Deal and into the Cold War. This was, not surprisingly, a history that focused on white males, those people who dominated electoral politics through those eras. Historians who came of age during the cultural upheavals of the 1960s shifted the focus away from white males and electoral politics to a social history that encompassed a broader range of Americans, most especially women and African Americans. As radical as this shift appeared at the time, it obscured, and I think still obscures, a deeper continuity with the older history. Women and African Americans earned center stage, partly as compensation for previous neglect, but also because of the urgency, an urgency stemming from their greater distance from access to freedom and equality, the freedom and equality that had been pursued by white men throughout American history. That is, women and minorities ultimately wanted, pursued, strove to attain what white men purportedly already possessed, some ideal of real freedom and equality that extended beyond politics to every aspect of culture. In centering Catholics, I'm only partly following this script. Certainly, I'm taking a marginal group and bringing them to the center, but for a different reason. The Catholics I wish to center did indeed embrace freedom and equality in a certain sense, but they were far more willing to understand these as limited to politics narrowly defined. They wished to secure the benefits of modern politics while maintaining continuity with deeper traditions of culture and faith. And in this, I would be arguing that they created a kind of alternative modernity, an alternative to the modernity of pure autonomy, and instead modernity of community. Now, what does all this have to do with Our Lady of Guadalupe? I'd argue that the dynamic interaction of tradition and modernity in United States Catholic history reflects a dynamic present in New World Catholic history from the earliest decades of discovery and conquest, reflected in, again, the Guadalupe event, if you will. The story of Our Lady of Guadalupe has a cultural dimension unlike any other Marian apparition in Catholic history. So, for example, Lourdes, the later apparition of Lourdes in the 19th century, Lourdes gave us a miracle, the miracle of the healing waters of Lourdes. Guadalupe has a miracle of sorts, a physical miracle, the miracle of the image of Our Lady on the tilma, the cloth, that again miraculously survives to this day. But beyond the miracle of its specific physical qualities and material survival over centuries, the tilma represents a kind of cultural miracle of affirming the dignity of Native peoples and culture in the face of Spanish Catholic conquest. The Virgin did not merely reach out to Juan Diego with love and mercy, but she looked like Juan Diego and dressed like an Aztec princess. Mary's message was undeniably Christian, yet her appearance was undeniably Native. Against those missionaries who early on saw Native culture as irredeemably corrupted by paganism, Guadalupe affirmed the beauty of Native ornament and the dignity of dark-skinned people. Despite the horrors of the conquest, this ideal of mixing the traditional, in this case, Old World Christianity, with the novel, certain aspects of Native pagan culture, would shape Latin American Catholic culture into a truly mixed or mestizo civilization, something new. Now, this historical, the story I've just told, the development of this culture, is a historical fact acknowledged even by secular historians. So, kind of theology aside, it is simply a fact. Recently, Yale historian Greg Grandin has celebrated this achievement in his best-selling book, America, published by Penguin just this year, 2025. This book is a comparative history whose early chapters chart two quite different models of European native interaction reflected in the different histories of North America and South America. In the North, Anglo conquest drove natives west and never significantly incorporated them into Anglo society, while in South or Latin America, Iberian conquest, despite its initial horrors, ultimately did incorporate natives into a New World Iberian civilization. So this is something that, again, even a secular historian like Grandin acknowledges. Despite his early praise for the Dominican priest Bartolome de las Casas in his defense of the Indians, however, Grandin gives little credit to Catholicism itself for shaping this mestizo culture. Grandin's grand narrative, and it's a big book, a big grand book, but his grand narrative serves rather to celebrate the thwarted dream of democratic socialism in Latin America and affirm the role of Latin America in laying the groundwork for the model of international relations that would triumph in the United Nations. So again, he's working in this very, very kind of Catholic milieu, Catholic cultural milieu, but he has different concerns. He's writing for different reasons. The book has been universally praised, though some reviewers have gently chided Grandin for glossing over Latin America's bloody history of military dictatorships, but they generally kind of give him a pass on this. Now, I'm not qualified to go toe-to-toe with Grandin on Latin American history. I point to his work only as a secular confirmation of the reality of this mestizo civilization, this alternative modernity that I'm talking about, and as an example of secular advocacy. He's advocating democratic socialism and a certain kind of Latin American view of international relations. So it's a secular advocacy that is, in fact, no more grounded in empirical reality than the Catholic advocacy that I'm proposing. So I'm just trying to kind of level the playing field here and engage the profession, but do so by acknowledging just what secular historians themselves are doing. So my approach to this material is very much one of advocacy, Catholic advocacy, but by advocacy, I do not mean triumphalism. I do mean that acknowledging the worst of Catholicism in history need not require ignoring the best. So yes, in the case of Latin America, there was a conquest, but yes, as well, there was the reality of cultural mixing and the creation of a new culture that combined the best of the old and the new. The contrast between Catholic Latin America and Protestant North America could not be sharper on this point, as even, again, secular historians acknowledge. Now, Latin America never achieved the relative political stability of North America, but its cultural achievement stands as something of a redeeming, saving grace that should give North American Catholics cause for some pause and cause even for some envy. This cultural achievement, until recently dismissed as a symptom of backwardness, is no mere survival of tradition in the modern world, moreover. It is, in fact, itself very modern, or again, in the words of the Catholic philosopher Rocco Buttiglione, modernity's alternative. So again, the sense of Catholicism is not just the persistence of tradition despite modernity. It is itself modern in its own way, but an alternative to the modernity in Buttiglione's story, and to some degree, Grandin, the modernity represented by North American kind of Protestant individualistic modernity. Now, again, to get back to Guadalupe as a kind of a model or a metaphor for all this, to turn to Guadalupe as a guide to United States Catholic history may seem to fly in the face of historical fact. Catholics in the United States did not transform the United States into anything like the kind of the Catholic culture of Latin America. Catholics, certainly by the 20th century, Catholics in America won acceptance largely by assimilating to that other modernity, Anglo-Protestant modernity, with its emphasis on economic efficiency rather than cultural flourishing, individual achievement over communal solidarity. Most Catholic leaders in the church and in academia have insisted that this is a legitimate synthesis of the universal truths of the faith with the particulars of US culture. By this standard, we cannot, even should not, adopt Latin American models for North America. As someone with severe reservations about the current synthesis of Catholicism and Anglo-Protestant modernity in the contemporary United States, I would argue that Catholics looking for an alternative communal modernity need not look only to Latin America. Catholics in America, in the United States, created their own version of this alternative modernity in the immigrant cities of industrial America. Now, in my book, American Pilgrimage, I take the Guadalupe event as a guiding metaphor for centering urban immigrant ethnic Catholicism within the history of the church in the United States. I would further state that this historical experience of Catholics provides a focus for an alternative reading of the United States history in general. That is, I'm not simply saying that, oh, this is the most important part of Catholic history, but it's a kind of standard by which to view the rest of American history. And the standard here is not simply Catholic faith, but also communal culture. Communal culture sustained in the face of the forces of American individualism. And in this, I'd say that I would diverge from the mainstream American Catholic historical narrative, which is focused on the ways in which Catholics fit into the mainstream narratives of American political culture. Now, there's some truth to this fit. Despite the slurs of anti-Catholic nativists, Catholics in America fully embraced the principles of American government from the start and never imagined America transformed into a European-style monarchy, much less a papal monarchy. This strain of American Catholic culture found vindication in the Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae. Still, this strain is only a part, and I would say not even the main part, of how American Catholics lived most of their daily lives in the century prior to Vatican II. Overwhelmingly poor, immigrant, working class, and ethnic, American Catholics had little time or inclination to consider abstract issues of political theory. To quote George Washington Plunkett of Tammany Hall, what's the Constitution among friends? That's like, you can't get, mired in these abstractions. Most of the life of Catholics was simply a struggle to survive. And in that struggle, the parish came first. Parochial structure of the Catholic Church, of course, dated back to the earliest centuries, but that structure had never had to adapt itself to anything like the dislocations of the industrial capitalist social revolution of the 19th century. Adapt it did, not by surrendering to modern dislocation, but by creating an island of relative stability, a shelter from the storms of modernity that was at the same time itself modern, but again, a distinctly alternative modernity in Buttiglione's sense. Put simply, the alternative modernity was a modernity of community. And here again, as with the mestizo civilization of Latin America, the historical reality of Catholic life, of Catholic communal life, has been confirmed by secular thinkers. The sociologist Herbert Gans dubbed this reality the urban village. That's the title of the 1962 work of his that studied Italians in Boston, the West End in Boston. In creating this term, the urban village, Gans was describing a reality, but also atoning for, I would say, the sins, or at least the blindness of sociologists past, who had tended to argue that the upheavals of immigration, urbanization, and industrialization had left European peasants rootless and alienated, isolated, alone in the modern metropolis. Secular thinkers through the 19th century simply assumed that the old world ways, most especially religion, were destined for the ash heap of history. They looked to new social systems, either capitalism or socialism, to provide a new unity. Not just a unity, but an order and a sense of meaning, all that had once been provided by religion. In America, neither of these new models were of much help. Socialism never really took root in America as it had in Europe, and capitalism was too anarchic to provide any order, much less meaning or purpose. For the average Catholic immigrant and the native-born generations that followed, the Church provided one of the few anchors of stability in this time of tremendous change. For this Catholic, that is me, the sight of a skyline with a church steeple next to a smokestack brings a tear to the eye. It's easy to forget how incongruous those two towers appeared at the time. In retrospect, they seem to stand for steady work and strong faith. They evoke the good old days of the Catholic urban village, when, despite the relative material deprivation, all seemed right with the world. It's kind of sense of, oh, we were poor, but we were happy, and we got along somehow. And we have to be wary of nostalgia, but again, fear of nostalgia should not blind us to historical reality. Secular historians with no stake in Catholic parish life have confirmed the persistence of community amidst industrial squalor and disorder, particularly in the Catholic communities of the industrial city. Again, I want to turn to a kind of secular example. One of my favorite works of Catholic history is one that few historians would consider a work of Catholic history, Robert Slayton's Back of the Yards, which came out in 1988. It's kind of a classic work of social history from that period. It is, as the title suggests, a study of the Chicago neighborhood named after the cattle pens that fed the industrial machine of the slaughterhouses, those slaughterhouses that inspired Carl Sandburg to dub Chicago hog butcher to the world. Slayton subtitles his book, however, The Making of a Local Democracy. Like Grandin, I think he misreads or at least misnames his own evidence to fit a certain kind of political ideal. A more appropriate subtitle for my reading of the book would have been The Making of a Catholic Community. Slayton tells the dynamic struggle for unity within a neighborhood that was in some sense less an urban village than a cluster of small, sometimes antagonistic urban villages. A common Catholic faith could often not unite people across ethnic lines, which were really, really strong and powerful and very divisive at times. That despite the common challenges of economic exploitation at the slaughterhouses and ultimately the Great Depression itself, again, those ethnic lines divided Catholics. They divided them into villages and communities, but kind of sometimes inhibited the creation of a larger community. Still, in Slayton's story, community triumphs in the end through the work of a man named Joe Megan, a neighborhood kid, an Irish Catholic in a neighborhood that was more Eastern European, certainly, than Irish, but a neighborhood kid who went away to college, though just Loyola of Chicago, so not too far away, not University of Chicago or anything like that, but Loyola Catholic College, but returned to the neighborhood to be a community leader and worked through the churches to overcome divisions and unify the neighborhood during the Great Depression. So to me, just a kind of a beautiful story, and one that really should be kind of at the heart of our understanding of the history of the church in America, but also of the Catholic presence in America more broadly. Figures like Joe Megan, however, have largely been lost to American Catholic memory. The whole immigrant, urban, ethnic, working class history of Catholic life in America has either been forgotten or reduced to a sentimental narrative of how hard work, grit, and determination brought a slow but steady rise up the social ladder, with a happy ending of Catholics earning their fair share of the American dream. Scholars of American Catholic history deserve much of the blame for this general social amnesia of American Catholics. The leading scholars of the last half century have rarely risen above the level of ambivalence with respect to this world. Historians of the Vatican II generation, I think, are particularly representative of this. They struggled, coming of age in the 1960s, in a certain kind of Catholic world in the 1960s. They struggled to navigate the mixed signals provided by their life in the profession and their life in the church. Within the profession, actually, social history, the history of urban working class ethnic life, was all the rage. And this provided a tremendous opportunity for historians of American Catholicism to argue for the right for Catholics to be center stage in this new field of social history. We get some sense of this in Jay Dolan's 1975 work, The Immigrant Church, New York's Irish and German Catholics, 1815 to 1865. And this book, again, was generally well received. It was published by Johns Hopkins University Press, which was a big deal for somebody dealing with a Catholic topic like this. But it was kind of a false start. Social historians could not forgive Catholics for being Catholics, and American Catholic historians could not forgive them for being the wrong kind of Catholic. That is, conservative ethnic Catholics instead of the kind of liberal post-ethnic Catholics who would point the way toward Vatican II. Again, this is at least in the mind of these historians. In promoting their version of Vatican II, historians of Dolan's generation downplayed the urban village of the immigrant church to privilege the middle class, call it Anglo-Catholic culture of the early republic. Think of figures like John Carroll, Bishop John Carroll. A culture in a moment in the history of the church that was primarily concerned to reconcile the church with American politics. So this became the focus of figures like Dolan. The rest of the profession, however, was not particularly interested in this kind of Catholicism, which struck them only as redundant to the mainstream story of American, the United States. Like, who cares if a bunch of Catholics, affirmed American politics? That was just a kind of an assumption that, well, of course, all Americans are going to do that. That struggle was really particular to the Catholic Church. Even the Protestant churches all were fully on board with that. This old urban Catholic ethnic world, however, did not entirely disappear either from history or reality. Well, certainly many Catholics became middle class and suburban after World War II. Many others found themselves on the front lines of a social struggle central to post-war American history, the Civil Rights Movement. Liberal suburban Catholics generally supported racial integration, but urban working class Catholics often opposed integration in housing, at least, for fear that the influx of African Americans would destroy their neighborhoods. By the 1990s, the attempt to make sense of this struggle brought American Catholic historians back to familiar urban ground, most notably in John McGreevy's study of urban Catholics and race, his Parish Boundaries in 1996. Primarily a study of these housing conflicts in various northern cities. Parish Boundaries, however, begins with a sympathetic account of the urban village of the city Catholic parish. Like J. Anthony Lucas in his Common Ground, his 1985 study of the battle over busing in South Boston, McGreevy at first defends Catholics from the simplistic charge of racism, arguing that Catholics resisted integration in the name of defending the integrity of a real existing community. That is, that they had something to defend. There was something real there. But still, in the end, McGreevy argues that this older idea of ethnic community had served its purpose, and that Catholics needed to open up their neighborhood to racial integration, regardless of the consequences. Now, this is a complicated, tragic story. I would say ultimately a tragedy of two goods, and I can't, what I want to do today, render final judgment on that issue itself. I only mean to highlight that in the case of McGreevy, there is this historical narrative of inevitable change, a sense that this old way of life just had to die, and that Catholics needed to open themselves to the new, generally meaning assimilation to American middle class norms, leaving that urban village behind. Now, change is indeed inevitable, but the direction of change is not. Assumptions of assimilation have obscured the idea of an alternative Catholic modernity that can creatively reconcile the old and the new. Now, I remain committed to a vision of faith open to new things, and a kind of history writing that holds up those moments of creative synthesis. To this, I say with Junipero Serra, siempre adelante. But those moving forward need some kind of guide. Serra did not blindly march north along the coast of California. He had a model of mission life inspired by medieval monastic communities and earlier efforts of missionaries to create settled Christian communities among formerly nomadic native peoples. The suburban model of Catholic life followed by the descendants of European immigrants strikes me as a kind of regression to nomadism, albeit a materially comfortable, high-tech form in which we follow market trends rather than animal herds. Sadly, this affluent suburban mobility seems to have accomplished what the old immigrant poverty failed to do. That is, to establish rootless wandering as an aspiration, as a kind of a sign of success. And I think perhaps this kind of aspiration to be rootless and wander, explains the current state of Catholicism in the United States better than the theological battles over Vatican II that have received so much more attention. Now, I'm the first to accuse myself of nostalgia when I say things like this. I grew up in one of the last of those urban villages in Rochester, New York, in the 10th ward of Rochester, New York, in the shadow of the smokestacks of Kodak Park. And I admit to having a certain bias against suburbia. To keep myself honest, I often turn to history for correction, or sometimes even confirmation. As I had recently had the pleasure of reading Stephen Coates' Crabgrass Catholicism, How Suburbanization Transformed Faith and Politics in Post-War America. And lo and behold, I found my prejudices confirmed rather than corrected. In this work, Coates links the socioeconomic structure of suburbia itself to the phenomenon of disaffiliation. 75 years of suburbia has produced nothing as distinctive or attractive as the old urban village. Catholic suburbia failed to provide an alternative modernity and largely has simply reproduced mainstream modernity. It continues in part because of a failure of social historical memory. Few middle-class Catholics can imagine any other way of living. But history can inspire us with models of different ways of living, maybe even better ways of living. Now, there's no going back, but again, historical models can inspire us to a brighter future. And in the spirit, again, of Junipero Serra, siempre adelante, via history. Okay, so there we go.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, um, Professor Shannon. So I guess I'll jump in with a first question here. Um, and I really enjoy how you framed this idea of seeking an alternative modernity, and I'm interested in this idea of localizing it to suburbia. But I also wonder if maybe you could talk about how the technological conditions of contemporary life also impact the way that today, if we're trying to push back against these either trends of disaffiliation or the assumption of assimilation, how um, the the ways that technological culture also contributes to us becoming more diffuse might make this project in some ways easier, right? The idea of being able to form Catholic community no longer just limited to geographic borders to one's urban village, but also more difficult, right? In that people are less rooted in place.
Yeah, it
Could you
is.
share something about how technology
Yeah.
is factoring in here?
Well, since I'm currently using technology to communicate with people, I can't say it's all bad, right? And I don't want to say that, just to be a kind of live Luddite, I mean, and that is my natural tendency, that, the modern technology, internet and such, do prevent certain opportunities for communication that didn't exist before. But I would tend to stress how they do undermine the kind of the physicality and embodiedness that made those urban villages. Now, the 19th century had to deal with a lot of new technologies. There was like film, for example. In these neighborhoods, there are often movie theaters, right? And so that's people are getting exposed to different stories and such. That takes them outside of the world. But the movie theater was still a place that you had to walk to, and then there were neighborhood theaters, and so they people were still able to be kind of embedded in space, if you will. And I think for the like for the kind of intellectual work that we're doing here, this type of communication, um, the medium we're using is fine, and it's a kind of a more effective, you could say, a medium than just like publishing a journal article or something like that. But intellectual work and social life are two different things. You know that I think the idea of like social media is just a oxymoron. That the idea that you kind of to build real thick social communities through the internet or online. Um, I think that's a kind of a dead end, and that there distinctions have to be made. And again, for intellectual communication, the type of thing we're doing now, these new technologies have their place, but the negative impact on social life, I think is just undeniable. Again, this isn't just me being a crazy Catholic or something, but all the sociological research shows this, and it is just texting is no substitute for talking to human beings. And I think in some ways in terms of the faith, is that because Catholics in America are certainly more educated than they were 100 years ago, they tend to see their faith more intellectually, more theologically. They're more likely to discuss theology now than they were 100 years ago. And so there's a temptation there that's like, oh, I'm in this really interesting online chat group about, the Eucharist or something. Um, Whereas, in the 100 years ago, the faith was much more about a practice. It was, living in a place and going to church, and those kind of material physical acts are what created community. And again, I think there's no substitute for that, and that we need to really be very much aware of the ways in which the technology can undermine that. Again, it has its places, it has its uses, but those need to be restricted, and we need to have a kind of an ecology, if you will, with an ecological mindset in how we use technology. And technology here, to go back to my opening metaphor, margin and center. Let's say, okay, technology has its place, but it should be on the margins. Embodied communal life, physical community life, walking community life. This is something that has to be at the center. So again, it's not an either or, but it is a kind of margin and center. And I would think that technology needs to be kept at the margins, useful in certain circumstances, but just physically living together has got to be at the center of our life and our faith.
Thank you. So we have a question from a viewer. Um, so could you say more about the conflicts that you described concerning um, Catholic communal modernity centered around the parish, right? That parish life becomes a central way of sustaining community, especially in the face of extremely difficult industrial conditions, but also um, becomes. It doesn't help to overcome, for instance, ethnic divisions. The idea that there's the Italian parish here, the German parish, 2 blocks down. They don't join forces. How does Our Lady of Guadalupe specifically maybe offer a model for how we can both sustain tight-knit community um, and have this idea of solidarity within pluralist conditions? So how might she um, be this figure to help us transcend that?
Well, I think I mean, certainly in the original kind of Mexican context, she overcame the divisions between the Spanish conquerors and the native peoples who were, in the process of being evangelized, but not too successfully until Guadalupe. I think there the the lesson I get from that, and you can to apply it to the urban ethnic parishes of America, is that it's the old unity and diversity. Um, I think that, separate Italian and Polish parishes, there's something good to that separateness, because it's only with that separateness can they work out their very kind of particular alternative modernity. How do you carry on Italian Catholic traditions in an industrial city? Though I disagree with some of his interpretations, Robert Orsi's work is at least addressing this problem of how, again, Italians maintained distinctive Italian traditions that often put them at odds with the Irish, who wanted everybody to be American. And so, like, I'm in one sense temperamentally inclined to support the Italians who want to carry on with their old ways, because there's nothing essential to the faith and what the Irish are trying to put on them. But I think Slayton's book is actually a good example of the limits of that. Is that, yes, you have your particular traditions, but if we're all we're in a pluralistic society, but we are living together under shared circumstances, shared challenges, and the the danger of the extreme urban villages, a kind of a tribalism, and the broader Catholic vision. I think that in a figure like Joe Megan proved able to overcome that, but he did it, and this is, Slayton is very, to me, very perceptive. Is that he says what Slayton did, excuse me, what Megan did was not tell the Italians and the Poles and the Slovaks, okay, you all have to be the same now. It's like, you keep doing what you're doing, but there is a common problem here, and we need to come together to transcend our ethnic differences to address these common problems. So, that's, I think, very different from, in many cases, what the Irish American priests often did is like, no, you got to be like us, get rid of those traditions. And so the, I think in the Latin American context, you get this more unity and diversity model, because it's not like all of Latin America had the same culture. There's a lot of variation among in the national context and even in the local context. I think, again, there's a model of that kind of variation and diversity in the old ethnic parishes. There were limitations to that, and I think maybe some of that kind of Irish American tradition of saying, "Hey, we have our differences, but we are all Catholic." The need to bring people together in a common Catholicism, that's there too. My general sense is, on a daily basis, when you're just kind of living your life, living your faith, that the particularity should be given the benefit of the doubt. But when problems emerge, or when there are issues that need common action, we can't be so tribal and ethnic that we can't even talk to people across the street. I just example from my own life. When we lived in South Bend, there were two churches that were one street away, and they looked kind of similar. So once we went into the wrong one, but there was St. Patrick's and St. Hedwig's because the Polish got sick of being shoved down in the basement by the Irish, and so they built their own church. Um, and again, sometimes, again, those divisions could be very strong. In Slayton's book on Chicago, he talks about like the Czechs and the Slovaks who hated each other, and there's like priests would like cross the street to not be on the same sidewalk with a priest of, oh yes, there's that Slovak and all, so like, yeah, I'd say that's going a bit too far, a bit too tribal. Um, but on the other hand, the after the war, the solution to that was like, oh well, forget about being Czech and forget about being Slovak. We're just going to be American Catholics, and that is definitely, to me, not the way to go, and that just dismisses kind of centuries of cultural tradition, and there's got to be a middle ground.
We have a few questions in the chat actually about, I suppose, meta questions about um, the writing of history, which I think is definitely um, extremely relevant to your remarks. So I'll combine them because I think they relate to one another. So um, we have one question about the extent to which Protestant individualism and the idea of sectarianism are still operant in the tradition of American historical writing, whether you see that still a kind of set of influential assumptions in the field. And then we also have this question about um, the writing of American Catholic history, whether, what the historiography looks like, but also if you could maybe tell us about how you, as a Catholic historian of Catholicism, kind of approach what you've talked about when it comes to continuity versus rupture, when it comes to advocacy versus triumphalism, I think was another dichotomy you brought up.
Yeah. Okay, so first I'll stick with the kind of the secular history question first, and then the Catholic one. Absolutely. I mean, they wouldn't. Secular historians would not call it Protestant individualism because those are both kind of bad words. Um, but they would call again this concept of autonomy, which seems like, well, that's not using the word Protestant or individualistic, but that is absolutely that kind of old Protestant individualism. And my first two books, which were more intellectual histories, is before I actually came to Catholic history, later in my career. But they were study of social science tradition that turned to culture. The idea of culture as a whole way of life that was kind of an antidote to the acids of modernity, and this was going to be this is what was going to save America from itself, from all of this anarchic individualism. But it's a complicated argument. But in the end, culture becomes this thing that we use to create ourselves. Culture becomes like the fodder for expressive individualism, and that I think is just I studied that, I examined that in early 20th century social science, but it's all over American history writing. That's what it's all about. It's just finding the newest frontier of autonomy. So that, yes, that's absolutely there. Um, it has, to some degree, also, I would say, infiltrated American Catholic history, where, just an example of a figure like McGreevy, who, expresses certain sympathy for these Catholic communities, but at the end says, well, they had to move beyond that. I mean, the heroes of his book in the end are the middle class Catholics. This middle class suburban Catholics who are righteous on race, and that's no small achievement. That was like the popes and the bishops were all like, yes, you need to welcome African Americans into your community, but it was racial justice was tied up with this kind of their own self-ethnic cleansing, just be getting rid of all of their older cultural attachments to become Americans. The civil rights movement, like that was the big American movement of the time. That's how Catholics a certain kind of Catholics affirm they're Americans. And that's, again, to me, I see that as still very dominant in the field of American Catholic history. The urban village is acknowledged, but again, with a degree of kind of caution and skepticism because, well, I guess it was patriarchal, right? So that's not good for women. It was hierarchical, and that's not good for anybody, right? And so in a lot of the history writing, even that deals with these kind of ethnic cultures, there is, I would say, in American Catholic history writing, this trajectory toward individualism. A figure like Robert Orsi, who I mentioned, who deals with the devotional culture of Italian Americans, but he follows this pattern that I saw in early 20th century social science, where in the end he sees it as opposed to the church, the institutional church, and there was a real conflict there, but most significantly, he sees the devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Harlem, in Italian Harlem. He sees this as Italians kind of creating their own culture, expressing themselves, taking control of their lives, asserting their independence from the church. This narrative of autonomy, what I would ultimately call individualism, drives a lot of American Catholic history. And I'm, in American Pilgrimage is, it's a narrative synthesis. Builds on a lot of this great work that has been done, but tries to put this great research and scholarship into a narrative that does not, move in the trajectory of individualism, in which community is center. And it's not that you can't pretend that community survives when it doesn't, But when it doesn't, I mean, I want to highlight, okay, this is a great tragedy. See, this is how these American cultural principles have undermined Catholic community and ultimately Catholic faith. Because again, after Vatican II, this individualism was expressed in a kind of do-it-yourself theology. And so I'm trying to, um, in my own way, um, at least propose to American Catholic historians that, hey, let's take this Catholic communalism seriously, not simply as a something that happened or existed in the past, but as a guide to studying history, because there's always going to be a guide. There's always a standard that is guiding these historians when they write, they describe, they explain, but they also judge. And so, let's have a debate about the standards that we're using to judge and assess this history that we're writing. And so far that hasn't really happened, but I'm still plugging away here trying to get a debate started.
Yeah, I think we're getting close to the end of our time together, but I have one more question that I will indulgently ask. And I ask this as myself, an intellectual historian. Um, One thing that your remarks have made me think about is the degree to which contemporary American historiography has really come to rest on political history as its foundation, or as the kind of um, I guess essential form of the American story. I think of the fact that, the back of the Yard's book that you mentioned has the subtitle, The Making of a Local Democracy, right? Or even, your reference to Boss Tweed, right? That it all comes back to politics and to finding institutional political power. And maybe we can even see, today the idea of politics itself becoming a substitution for culture that existed in other ways. And I wonder if maybe speaking as an intellectual historian as well as a historian of the Catholic Church, if you can maybe say more about what it means to look beyond political history and how the unique nature of our faith and our church and having all of these local traditions and also this transnational character might allow us to think beyond just politics as our lens for doing history.
Yes, absolutely. That I think that the again, one of my problems with even American Catholic history has been the dominance of trying to shoehorn Catholic life into the American political model. And one of the great strengths of social history in its early decades, say the 70s, maybe early 80s, is that they actually said, no, that's not what's really happened. Like, that's not the most important thing. Politics is not the most important thing. And in that, when you push politics aside and say, well, I mean, certainly it's part of history, but it's not the most important part, that's when you can really, again, kind of center this Catholic social life and Catholic communal life. And just you don't always have to be referencing, the politics. And that again, there's that moment in social history when that could have happened with Catholics, but didn't. Now it's interesting. It's kind of once the historians, once the baby boomers pretty much came of age, then they started caring about politics again, and so politics has in American history, even just electoral politics and party politics has an importance once again that it didn't in the 60s and 70s when, let's say, people that were writing social history were out of political power. And so it's kind of returned. They talk about the new political history. No one would have touched the New Deal in the 60s and 70s, or no serious historian goes, that's just, who cares about that? Nothing going on there. Think of a figure like Alan Brinkley, who wrote Voices of Protest, which was about Father Coughlin and Huey Long, these people that weren't Roosevelt in the 1930s. And then, 10 years later, he writes the New Deal because, this is the great liberal achievement of the 20th century, and we have to stick to that. And, Catholics, I think especially Catholics have to be wary of being drawn into that, especially now when, if you look at mainstream politics, and I would say neither option, neither of the two main options available to Americans should make Catholics feel comfortable. I mean, there's a time, I understand now in the 30s and 40s or whatever, that kind of New Deal era where Catholics could have seen that as consistent with certain interpretation of the social encyclicals, but now, in contemporary American politics, doesn't really offer much for an integrated Catholic approach to life, and so all the more reason to kind of to steer away from that and to focus on life as it was lived, apart from politics, under the radar of politics, and that I think really should be the focus of Catholic historical thinking and writing.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Professor Shannon, for joining us for uh, both a fascinating lecture on the nature of Catholic life in America, as well as the nature of American Catholic history. Um, I will definitely be taking these reflections, through the duration of Advent. Um,
I don't know. I don't know. I think you can find better things to think about during Advent. A devotional.
it's a few weeks, right?
Okay.
Um, thank you all as well who joined us at home. Um, We hope you enjoyed this event as well. If you're viewing the video after the fact, you enjoyed the discussion. For anyone who is joining us from Philadelphia, we invite you to join us tomorrow evening, December 10th. I suppose I sort of misspoke. We have one more co-sponsored event tomorrow. We are co-hosting Carols by Candlelight. Um, an ecumenical Christmas event with the Penn and Drexel Newman Center at the St. Agatha St. James Church in University City. All are welcome. I believe that it begins at 7 p.m. So if you're in the Philadelphia area, we invite you to join us for this beautiful evening of community and music during the Advent season. Um, and with that, thank you all for joining us, and we will be ending the event here.
Thank you very much, Quinn.
All right. I think that's